All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a staggering 300-year history. I want you to imagine a modern tech giant, right? But armed with its own literal navy and army. That is essentially what we're looking at today. Now, we aren't just going to do a dry, boring timeline of the European arrival in India. Instead, we're exploring this as a high-stakes, intensely competitive tournament for global dominance. It's this wild story of ambition, rivalry, and a scramble for wealth that completely reshaped the world. So you really got to ask yourself this central question. How did a simple, seemingly innocent search for mundane, everyday spices, things like black pepper and cardamom just to flavor food back in Europe, how did that ultimately lead to the total colonization of an entire subcontinent by a corporate trading entity? The sheer scale of this historical shift is absolutely incredible. And figuring out exactly how it happened is what this explainer is all about.
Okay, let's just dive right into it. The absolute catalyst moment happened in 1498. That's when the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama arrived at Calicut. For centuries, trade between Europe and India traveled over these really complex, dangerous land and sea routes that were controlled by various middlemen. But da Gama successfully navigated a direct sea route via the Cape of Good Hope right at the southern tip of Africa. This single, highly perilous voyage bypassed all those traditional overland routes. It yielded an absolutely massive profit margin for the investors back home, and it officially kicked off the European era in India.
Here's our roadmap for The Explainer. We're going to cover the quest for new trade routes, the arrival of the European powers, those intense Anglo-French rivalries, the fall of Bengal, the wars subduing Mysore and the Marathas, and finally, the infamous subsidiary alliance system.
All right, jumping into part one, the quest for new trade routes.
Now, the situation that actually drove Europe out onto the open ocean was incredibly complex. It wasn't just one single light bulb moment that pushed ships into the unknown. It was this vast web of intersecting causes. You had massive political shifts, like the monopoly held by merchants in Venice and Genoa. You had the psychological push of the Renaissance and this massive desire for glory, coupled with a deep religious zeal to spread Christianity. But to really make sense of it, we can basically distill that massive web down to three primary driving forces. First up, economic growth. Europe's economy was booming, which created this immense demand for Indian commodities like spices, silks, and precious stones, along with a huge drive to just maximize profits. Second, technological advances. You had major breakthroughs in shipbuilding, navigation, and, crucially, the use of gunpowder, which made these long-range sea voyages actually possible and defensible. And third, geopolitical shifts. The Ottoman capture of Constantinople meant those traditional overland routes became highly taxed and deeply unstable. Europe literally had to find a way around. Moving on to part two. The European powers arrive, and the massive scramble for India begins. So the Portuguese actually got there first, and they quickly dominated the west coast. And they didn't just bring ships, they brought real military innovations like castled prows and cannons. Under leaders like Francisco de Almeida, they initiated what they called the Blue Water Policy, which was basically a strategy of absolute naval superiority. By 1510, they'd captured Goa, which became their capital, followed by major strongholds in Daman and Diu, firmly planting their flag right on the subcontinent. But, they weren't alone for long. Arriving around 1605, the Dutch East India Company aggressively crowded the coastline. They essentially supplanted the Portuguese as the dominant power for a while there. They captured territory and set up these highly lucrative factories, which were essentially just fortified trading depots on both the east and west coasts, in places like Surat, Machipatnam, Pulakat, and Chinsura. And then, of course, enter the final major contender, the French. They showed up a bit later, around 1664, but man, they made up for lost time by establishing vital, highly strategic strongholds. Pondicherry became their absolute crown jewel in the south, along with settlements in Mahé and Chandernagore. So by the early 1700s, the Indian coastline is getting seriously overcrowded with these heavily armed, highly ambitious European trading corporations. Which brings us to part three, the Anglo-French rivalries, or essentially the clash of the megacorporations. With so many players on the board, a clash was completely inevitable. As the lesser powers like the Portuguese and Dutch started to fade or shift their focus elsewhere, the stage was perfectly set for our two biggest rivals. And if we look at the structural DNA of the English and French companies, the differences are pretty striking.
The English East India Company was a private, joint stock company. It had total financial autonomy, a laser focus on profitable commerce, and incredibly strong naval and command leadership. The French, on the other hand, were a state-sponsored enterprise. They were completely tied down by the whims of the French king. They actually prioritized territorial conquest over making a profit, and sadly for them, their efforts were often plagued by government corruption and pretty incompetent generals. The French were just at a fatal structural disadvantage from the start.
And that exact structural disadvantage played out violently across the three Carnatic Wars. It's fascinating to notice how global politics just bled right into Indian territory here. The first war was sparked by the Austrian War of Secession all the way over in Europe. The second was driven by local dynastic disputes in India, where the English and French backed rival native rulers like a giant proxy war. But it was a third Carnatic War, tying into the global 7 Years' War, that finalized things. In 1760, the British decisively routed the French at the Battle of Wandiwash. The resulting Treaty of Paris effectively ended French political ambitions in India forever, leaving the English companies standing completely alone.
So now we hit part 4, the fall of Bengal, where we see them pivot from merchants to masters. At this point, the English East India Company stops fighting other Europeans and turns its attention directly to Indian royalty. And the fuse for this massive conflict was lit decades earlier by a document often called the Magna Carta of the company. Back in 1717, the Mughal Emperor Farrukhsir issued a firman, a royal decree that granted the English duty-free trade in the incredibly wealthy province of Bengal. It also gave them the right to issue dostocks, or passes, to exempt their goods from transit duties. Well, the company's servants severely misused these passes for their own private, untaxed trade. This continuous, massive loss of revenue absolutely infuriated the Manabs of Bengal and set them on a direct collision course with the British. And that collision totally boils over into 2 insanely consequential battles that transformed the English from mere merchants into the outright masters of Bengal. First, you have the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Now, the British didn't win this purely by military might. Robert Clive famously hatched a conspiracy with the Nawab's own commander, Mir Jafar, who literally betrayed his ruler right on the battlefield. Then, a few years later in 1764, the Battle of Buxar proved British military supremacy once and for all. Major Monroe defeated a combined force of Indian rulers. The outcome? The Treaty of Allahabad, which handed the British the Diwani, the direct right to collect revenues from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. They now held the keys to the treasury of India's richest province.
Let's jump to part 5, subduing the major Indian powers, specifically Mysore and the Marathas. Armed with the immense wealth of Bengal securing their finances, the British start looking to expand. But down in the south, they hit a brick wall. The military juggernaut of Mysore, led by Hyder Ali and his brilliant son, Tipu Sultan. This became a relentless 4-part struggle spanning over 30 years. The first 2 wars essentially ended in stalemates, which really proves Mysore's incredible strength at the time. But in the 3rd war, Tipu Sultan suffered heavy territorial losses. And finally, in the 4th Anglo-Mysore War of 1799, Tipu Sultan was killed in battle while defending his capital. His brilliance and modern tactics seriously delayed the British war machine, but ultimately they just couldn't stop it forever. Mysore was partitioned. Meanwhile, the British also faced the incredibly formidable Maratha Confederacy. But here we see a really tragic recurring theme: internal division. The British expertly utilized infighting among the Maratha leaders, like Scindia, Holkar, and the Peshwa, to basically divide and conquer. While the First War bought 20 years of peace, the Second War resulted in the humiliating Treaty of Bassein in 1802, where the Peshwa essentially surrendered his independence completely. By the end of the Third Maratha War in 1819, the once mighty Maratha Confederacy was permanently shattered. Which brings us to part 6, the subsidiary alliance system. Basically, the ultimate imperial checkmate. So you gotta wonder, how did the British actually manage to hold on to all this power over such vast territories without constantly fighting endless wars? Well, Lord Wellesley devises this system, and honestly, it's an absolute masterstroke of imperialism. Indian rulers were heavily pressured into signing treaties where they literally had to pay to maintain British troops in their own territory. They had to cut ties with all other Europeans. They couldn't even speak to neighboring Indian states without British permission. They had to host a British resident to constantly watch over them. And worst of all, they had to disband their own local armies. These states were supposedly protected, but in reality, independent rulers were systematically stripped of their sovereignty and turned into mere puppets of a paramount British power. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. It really leaves us with this profound, lingering question. In the relentless quest for trade, how much power is simply too much?
I mean, what started with just a handful of wooden ships searching for pepper and spices culminated in a private corporate entity wielding the raw power of an empire, absorbing an entire subcontinent. It's a staggering historical reality, and one that perfectly demonstrates how unchecked corporate economics, technology, and sheer human ambition can completely rewrite the destiny of millions. I hope this explainer made this massive historical shift clear and fascinating for you. Keep questioning how our modern world was built, and I'll catch you in the next one.